Let's get more on this with presidential historian Michael Purdy, who joins me via Skype. Thanks for being with us. So what would you say, and I know it's very difficult to boil it down to one or two things, but what is the lasting legacy of George H.W. Bush? He only served one term until '92. What do you think is the top headline in terms of his legacy?
I think the top headline is his basic sense of decency. Certainly, he was a partisan politician, but he was a decent person. He valued relationships incredibly. He lived in a world where civility reigned. He was a compromiser, a consensus builder, a collaborator. You just look at what he did in terms of personally pulling together the Gulf War coalition. But he was not a natural politician in many ways. He was awkward. He was more of a technocrat and a manager than a politician. He once said that he had trouble with what he called the vision thing. And but I think it's his basic sense of decency, and that's very much contrasted today, of course, with what we see in political life in the United States.
Because oftentimes we measure really the impact and the legacy of a president who passes away against the president currently serving. Not specifically Donald Trump. In this case, it's Donald Trump. But if he'd passed away when, for instance, Barack Obama was president, we would have done the same. But domestically, if there is something that the president, former President George H.W. Bush did that had a lasting impact, what would that be, politically speaking?
So I think politically speaking, his lasting impact domestically is probably not really good. He, of course, lost re-election because of the recession in the United States. And he was seen as aloof and not very sensitive to the needs of people. So we can go back and look at the 1992 debate in which the candidates were asked, how has the recession personally impacted you? And Bush, the sitting president, gave a really very weak answer. And he started to talk about interest rates, and he was kind of pulled back and said, no, how has it impacted you personally? And he started to get very defensive, and that's really contrasted with what Bill Clinton did right after that, where he goes up and he talks to the questioner and says, so tell me how it's impacted you. And so this is, again, part of where Bush was not a natural politician.
He had conceded that was one of his weaknesses as well, and also accepted that that was probably the reason he lost re-election. In terms of foreign policy, of course, we at CNN cover Iraq and the Middle East a lot. There was the first Gulf War. Kuwait, in fact, honored George H.W. Bush as their liberator. They wrote a message on towers in Kuwait City, lighting up these towers in his honor with a picture of George H.W. Bush. In Iraq, I'm not sure that people would all be so ready to celebrate him, because he did encourage Kurds and Shiites to rise up against Saddam Hussein, and that's something that a lot of people felt he then abandoned them after he'd encouraged them to rise up after the Gulf War ended. So he does leave a mixed legacy there in the Middle East.
He certainly does, although probably very few presidents besides George H.W. Bush came to the presidency with as much foreign policy experience as he did. And so though he may have made mistakes, and all presidents do, he had a good handle on foreign policy, again, because I think it was built on relationships that he established with foreign leaders, and he established those relationships wherever he went, and he really genuinely cared about people. I think he wasn't very good in the public spotlight. He was better behind the scenes and working deals. He was really the ultimate deal maker, you might say.
But, and interestingly, in the Middle East as well, and this is something that I was reading up on his accomplishments or his track record in the Middle East, I found interesting. He had tied with Israel billions of dollars in economic and military aid to a freeze and settlement activity, which is not something that after his presidency you saw a lot from U.S. presidents.
Right. I mean, Bush's record, again, is going to be much stronger in the foreign policy area, but he certainly had areas where he was not strong. Um, you know, part of it, again, is the fact that he was not as adept in public. He was not a charismatic president like, say, Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton or even John F. Kennedy, who we actually met at one point in 1962. So it's surprising in some ways that George H.W. Bush rose to the presidency. He was at the right time, the right place.
And I was going to say, sorry to jump in, but in this age of Twitter and social media, it's, I mean, who knows? But I mean, it's very difficult to imagine a man with his personality winning any kind of election in these days, I mean.
Absolutely. And I think he would have been a very uncomfortable Twitter president because, again, his focus was on one-on-one personal relationships. He was not a grandstander. And he domestically, we could go back and look at his mistakes where he tried to be tough. And he said, you know, no new taxes, read my lips. And so he's trying to be tough. But he didn't do a good job at it. And of course, he had to go back and eat those words later on.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael Purdy, for joining us with more on the legacy of George H.W. Bush. Appreciate it.